identity as a Black leader absolutely influences my work. For those people who know me well, they know that I've always been a race man, and some of that comes from my lived experiences, and some of that comes from my learned experiences. So, with regard to my lived experiences, I grew up in the Bronx in New York City, and certainly have some early memories of how I was reminded by my community, and that community being my school environment, my neighborhood, my family environment. But from an early age, was reminded and constantly reinforced what it meant to be Black and what it meant to be male growing up in New York City. Some of that lived experience is also realized for me as a Black person who was educated in the American South. So I moved to Atlanta in 1991 to attend Emory University here in Atlanta, Georgia, and had some prolific experiences as early as college, where I had been racially profiled on more than one occasion, unfortunately, despite the amazing educational experience that I overall had at Emory, and also here in the East Lake community. Had one or two experiences where I am reminded that I am in an ever-changing community, and while I'm here to work with and on behalf of the residents we serve, have had some racial incidents in East Lake as well. As it relates to the learned experience, I am proud to be a purpose-built communities racial equity ambassador. So I've gone through a solid 2 years of learned racial equity training and have continued on that journey beyond the 2 years of the program. To give you, Zachary, a simple example, the learned experience for me is understanding the importance of someone saying that they are anti-racist instead of saying, oh, I'm not racist, because there is a distinct difference. And we've learned that over the last several years. And where the rubber meets the road for me with the lived experience and the learned experience is working in a community where our mixed income housing overwhelmingly serves residents who are Black in apartment rental housing, as does the charter school that the ESIC Foundation started in partnership with Atlanta Public Schools 21 years ago. So for me, it's a constant reminder that for me to understand the experiences, good and bad, the dreams, the aspirations, and the goals for our residents in this community, that they look like me and they've had some of the same experiences that I've had, or I've had some of the same experiences that they've had. And that informs everything that I do as a leader in our community, with our residents, and even with my staff. So for me, racial equity, in full admission, I don't know that I had the lens and the most accurate frame for what racial equity looks like in this work prior to about 2012 or 2013. As I mentioned before, certainly the lived experiences informed my learned experiences and informs my professional practice. But I feel like as a country, as a nation, as a society, we've just gotten a bit more savvy about racial equity. So the last 8 or so years that I've implemented a racial equity lens through my work before the organization started formally doing it, purpose-built in the ESIC Foundation, for me, it's always meant thinking about 3 things. It means thinking about the people for whom we work alongside with and whom we attempt to serve. And it's engaging our residents in our mixed income housing. And I keep saying that, by the way, Zachary, because the larger neighborhood looks a little bit differently than the demographic makeup of our residents living in the mixed income housing within the neighborhood. But thinking about our people, thinking about our residents, and how do we engage them in the most thoughtful, intentional manner to realize that the abject poverty that residents in this neighborhood once lived in is the result of systemic racism and not the result of, let's say, a bad set of choices or decisions they made, which I think stereotypically and historically has been the assumption. It's thinking about our partners and making sure that they see racial equity as a value, and that value is reflected in the way that they serve our residents. And then last, I'd say, is the practice or our operations. And it's thinking about how we are intentional with exercising and demonstrating racial equity as a value in the vendors that we choose. Now, it's easy for most people to think in a very stereotypical way about vendors, to think about who it is that prepares their food or who it is that covers their security. But I'm a firm believer in, in putting your money where your mouth is, and where you spend your money, how you spend your money, what you give your money to are important, but who holds your money is also important. So for us, the Eastlake Foundation, it's been a value for us to have a banking relationship, a partnership relationship with a Black-owned bank. And we do that here in Atlanta with Citizens Trust Bank. And also to think about our wealth managers and the way we engage with them at our majority institutions, and then also to interface with banks like community credit unions, lending institutions, because of what it means for our community. And in Atlanta, we are proud of our partnership with the Delta Community Credit Union, which is not a Black owned bank, but it is a Black led bank. So I definitely have seen over the last several years, and there has been this trifecta, I believe, that's influenced this. COVID is one thing, the COVID-19 pandemic, certainly the civil unrest that was the result of racial violence against people of color, particularly against Black people throughout 2020. And then certainly all of the upheaval in government at a national, local way. I think 2020, all three of these things came to a head. Certainly the pandemic we didn't know existed until 2020. But the other two things, the civil unrest because of the racial violence against people of color, and the leadership, a lack of leadership on so many different levels in this country, have all lent themselves to major organizations and institutions emphasizing racial equity. My hope is that it is not a bandwagon trend, and that this is the long game that these major institutions and organizations are playing. And what I hope that the community redevelopment field in the nonprofit sector can do is a few things. I think we can hold these majority organizations and institutions in the nonprofit sector and corporate sector accountable to do what they're saying they want to do around a set of racial equity goals and some reconciliation. Two, I think we can continue to lead the conversations around toxic stress and the relationship between toxic stress and racial inequity, and making it something that's real, so people understand that an expectant mother can pass along toxic stress to her unborn child, and that is most common in families who suffer from abject poverty because of systemic racism, and in this country, particularly with people of color. And when you look at the connection between toxic stress and life expectancy, it's hard to not imagine how we could be as a nation more intentional about a better set of health outcomes, so that someone like me as a Black male isn't sentenced to a shorter life as early as birth because of the amount of toxic stress and the amount of systemic racism that I have to endure that starts well before me. I am particularly proud of what I call the Eastlake Blueprint and what it has meant for the community redevelopment field. I am a firm believer in giving credit where it's due. So I would say to you that it's purpose-built communities that was able to codify that blueprint into a model, into a holistic, integrated model. So certainly when the Eastlake Foundation started its work, we knew that we had to do more than transform just housing, from public housing into mixed income housing. But along the way, as we tinkered and figured out what those other things were, and we realized that it had to be education, It had to be community wellness, which is everything from fiscal wellness to recreation, to healthcare and physical wellness, to job force development, to access to food, because the East had been a food desert for 40 years, to also think about economic development. It wasn't until Purpose Built codified that and said, this is the model that has evolved through the success of the East Lake Foundation's work. So I'm particularly proud of that. And I would also say to you, quite transparently, I'm proud of the way that we've grown. So no question that when this work started in 1995, the prevailing concept was around equality. And how do we realize that people who are poor and or people who are Black or people of color not only deserve access and the tools and resources and the support to realize the American dream, but over some amount of time, we evolved that conversation to not be about equality and treating people the same, but to having that conversation be about equity. And as it relates to racial equity, realizing because of systemic racism, through bad policies and private actions, bad public policies and private actions rather, that we needed to be very square and unapologetic about our focus on equity and specifically racial equity. So that's what I would say, the blueprint that got codified by purpose-built communities into a model, and the shift over time from this paradigm of equality to a paradigm of equity with an emphasis on racial equity is what I'm most proud of.